The mountains of Luzon can seem almost peaceful in memory. Ridges roll away into the distance, covered in thick greenery and broken only by bare rock and the occasional winding trail. But in the spring of 1945, those ridges were anything but peaceful. They were the last refuge of Japanese forces clinging to the high ground, and they were the place where a 22-year-old American infantryman named William H. Thomas made a decision that would cost him his life and save many others. Before we continue, I want to mention the Medal of Honor book series that accompanies this work. These books tell the stories of America's Medal of Honor recipients in a serious, readable, and historically grounded format, with each volume focused on a specific campaign, battle, or part of the war. They are available in color paperback, Kindle ebook, and matching audiobook editions. You can find them at militaryauthor.me. This is Beyond the Call, Medal of Honor Stories from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Today we follow Private First Class William H. Thomas of the United States Army, and we climb with him up a narrow ridge in the Zambales Mountains. William H. Thomas was born on January 13, 1923, in Wynne, Arkansas. He grew up in a world that was still feeling the aftershocks of the First World War and the deep hardship of the Great Depression. Like many young Americans in small towns, his early life was shaped by hard work, close community, and a sense that when something needed doing, you simply stepped up and did it. When war came after Pearl Harbor, that sense of duty found a wider stage. Thomas entered the Army as the nation mobilized for a two-ocean conflict. The record later listed his service as credited to Ypsilanti, Michigan, a reminder of how the war scattered families and young workers across the country in search of jobs and training and a chance to serve. By 1945, Thomas found himself in the Pacific, assigned to Company B of the 149th Infantry Regiment, part of the 38th Infantry Division. The division carried the nickname Cyclone Division and was deeply involved in the campaign to retake the Philippines. Luzon, the largest and most important island in the chain, had become a sprawling battlefield. Japanese forces, driven from the coasts and larger towns, dug into the interior high ground. They constructed bunkers, fighting holes, and cleverly concealed positions overlooking trails and approaches that American units would have to climb. In that environment, the job of an automatic rifleman was especially dangerous. An automatic rifle was a shoulder-fired weapon that could fire rapidly with a larger magazine than a standard rifle. It was not as heavy or fixed as a full machine gun, which usually required a crew and a tripod, but it could still lay down a stream of bullets. In a small infantry squad, the automatic rifleman was often the backbone of the unit's firepower. When an attack stalled, it was his weapon that was expected to beat down enemy fire long enough for the rest of the squad to move. On April 22, 1945, Company B was ordered to drive Japanese troops from a hill position in the Zambales Mountains. To reach that hill, they had to move along a narrow wooded ridge, a strip of high ground just wide enough to walk, with steep drops on either side and dense vegetation all around. The enemy held the higher ground at the far end, with camouflaged positions that commanded the approaches. From there, they could fire down the length of the ridge and hurl explosives onto any soldiers trying to advance. In the leading squad, taking point on that exposed spine of earth, was PFC William H. Thomas with his automatic rifle. He was 22 years old, but already a veteran of Pacific fighting. As the squad inched forward, he used his weapon to provide covering fire. Short bursts aimed at the hidden enemy positions above them. The men behind him advanced by bounds, moving when his fire was hot, dropping when the enemy answered back. They could not see every rifle or machine gun, but they could hear the shots and feel the impact of bullets snapping into trees and dirt around them. The Japanese defense on that ridge was not based on rifles alone. The enemy also used explosive charges. These could be small satchel charges or bundled grenades, thrown or rolled downhill. Gravity did much of the work. As Company B's point element drew closer, the defenders began to hurl those charges down the slope, hoping to break the attack before it reached their positions. One of those explosives landed almost at Thomas's feet. The blast was devastating. In a single violent instant, both of his legs were torn away below the knees. Shrapnel and debris ripped into his body. The concussion knocked men off their feet and sent up a spray of dirt and smoke that momentarily obscured the trail. On such a narrow ridge, a hit like that did more than wound a single soldier. It threatened to block the entire advance, to create a tangle of casualties, confusion, and fear that the enemy could exploit. Under normal circumstances, the next steps were obvious. Medics and nearby soldiers would rush in, pull the wounded man back to a safer position, and try to stop the bleeding. The rest of the squad would shift their formation, find another way to bring fire forward, and hope the enemy did not seize the moment to counterattack. But on that day, on that ridge, the man at the center of the blast refused to play the expected role. Despite the trauma and shock, PFC Thomas remained conscious. He understood, in a flash of brutal clarity, what his removal from the fight would mean. He was the forward automatic rifleman. If he allowed himself to be dragged back, the point of the attack would lose its heaviest gun at the worst possible moment, under the enemy's direct observation. The men behind him would have to reorganize under fire. The attack could stall or fail, and the enemy could turn the narrow ridge into a killing ground. So Thomas made a choice. He refused evacuation. He waved off those trying to pull him back. Instead, he propped himself up as best he could, badly wounded, and settled in behind his automatic rifle. While his comrades scrambled forward and medics tried to reach other casualties, he opened fire again. Burst after burst hammered into the enemy's camouflaged positions above. His rounds tore into foliage and dirt and the hidden shapes within them, forcing heads down and disrupting the defenders' aim. The sight of him doing this, legless yet firing steadily, had a powerful effect on the men of his platoon. They saw that the lead gun was still in action. They knew that someone was keeping the enemy's fire suppressed while they moved. In small unit combat, that kind of confidence is as important as any formal order. It meant that the soldiers behind him could continue their advance, hugging the ridge, rushing forward in short dashes, knowing that the enemy at the top was not free to fire with impunity. The Japanese defenders saw him too. They recognized that the automatic rifle was a threat they had to eliminate. Their fire focused on him. Bullets kicked up dirt all around his position. One of them finally struck the weapon itself, wrecking its mechanism and making it useless. For most soldiers, that would have been the end of direct participation in the fight. For Thomas, it was simply a signal to change tactics. With his rifle disabled, he reached for his grenades. A grenade is a small explosive that can be thrown by hand. In close terrain, having grenades means a soldier can attack enemies sheltered behind cover or in holes that bullets cannot easily reach. Despite his immense wounds and loss of blood, Thomas pulled the safety pins from his remaining grenades and began to throw them toward the enemy positions. These were not random tosses. They were controlled throws, based on his training and his feel for distance and angle on that slope. Each grenade arced over and exploded among the Japanese defenders who had been trying to break the American advance. These blasts killed several enemy soldiers and further disrupted the defense. The official record credits Thomas with destroying 3 enemy soldiers after he had already lost both legs, a stark measure of how effective those last grenades were. All this time, he continued to refuse medical aid. As long as he could fight, he chose to stay where he was, holding that critical point on the ridge. His position became the anchor of the entire platoon's movement. While he fired and threw grenades, the rest of Company B pushed past him, moving up and over the ground that he had kept open. They closed in on the enemy's stronghold on the hill and, in bitter close combat, overran the positions that had been dominating the ridge. Only after the attack had pushed through and the enemy line had broken did the full cost of Thomas's stand become clear. His wounds were mortal. He would not leave the battlefield alive. He died later that day from blood loss and trauma. He never heard the final report that the hill had been secured and that his platoon had held the gain purchased in part by his decision to stay. For his actions on April 22, 1945, PFC, William H. Thomas was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation describes the explosive that severed his legs, his refusal of evacuation, his continued fire with the automatic rifle, and his final use of grenades to kill enemy soldiers and ensure the success of his platoon's attack. It notes that his selfless courage prevented the repulse of his platoon and made possible the capture of the enemy position. Behind those formal words lies a human story. Thomas was 22 years old, an age when most people are only beginning adult life. In another world, he might have gone back to Arkansas or Michigan, built a career, raised a family, and told small stories of his time in service. Instead, his life ended on a narrow ridge in a distant mountain range, remembered in detail because of what he chose to do in his last minutes. For his fellow soldiers in the 38th Infantry Division, Thomas became a symbol of the quiet, determined courage that ordinary men could show under extraordinary pressure. He did not give a speech or wait for applause. He simply recognized the tactical reality in front of him and chose to act in a way that put the safety and success of his platoon ahead of any hope of his own survival. His body was shattered, but his will remained fixed on the mission. For us, years later, his story offers a way to understand the Pacific War on a human scale. Campaign maps and after-action reports can show us divisions, objectives, and casualty numbers. They cannot fully capture what it meant to be one of the soldiers moving up those ridges, feeling the ground shake under explosions, and hearing a comrade behind you still firing even after suffering wounds you can hardly imagine. When we read about the liberation of the Philippines, the capture of Luzon, and the collapse of Japanese resistance, we should remember that every one of those large outcomes rested on acts like Thomas's stand on that ridge. Beyond the Call exists to tell these stories not to glorify violence, but to honor the individuals who faced it and chose to act with courage and selflessness. Private First Class William H. Thomas of Wynne, Arkansas, gave his life so that his platoon could live and his unit could advance. On that day in the Zambales Mountains, he proved that heroism often looks like a wounded soldier refusing to let go of his weapon, determined to do his duty until his last breath. By remembering him, we remember the cost paid by his generation and the responsibilities that come with the freedoms they helped secure. His name, engraved alongside others in the rolls of Medal of Honor recipients, reminds us that history is not just dates and places, but real people making impossible choices on narrow ridges far from home.